So the proof of concept was I put on the EEG, I created an iOS app that was listening to the delta wave, and then I was running a MIDI cable. This is this can convert. So here's the signal path. So this on my head, Bluetooth into this device, and I have an iOS app that hears the data coming from the headband. And then this is a lightning to USB converter. And then, I'm sorry, lightning to MIDI converter. And this is a MIDI cable that goes directly into old school hardware. So it's very direct. It's not through a computer. There's all the data mapping happens in the app. And so on that first one, I just plugged it into, I have a, do you know modular synthesis? Where you buy all your own modules and essentially make your own synthesizer. I just had one, it was my MIDI to CV module, and the only thing I needed was when it receives a MIDI signal, it lights up. That's it. Like no sound, it was just, just to test if there was a MIDI signal coming out. So I hooked it up, I put the thing on, it was crazy. I, had it mapped to if my delta would trigger a certain threshold, that it would send a MIDI note. And I put it on and I cleared my brain. My delta went down and went below a certain threshold, and I saw that light go on. And it was just a complete eureka moment of, if I can play a note with thought, like not touching the thing, just like thinking, if I can play, eventually I can do a full performance. I can eventually build on this and build it and do something that's a whole symphony. So the current signal flow, it was a proof of concept. The current signal flow, which I've got here, you start with my brain, goes into the data app, and then that MIDI cable goes into this electron, and this is a sampler. It can work pretty well as a drum machine or a synthesizer, but it's a sampler. You load samples into it. So also an effects processor. So I'll be doing some effects processing of the Octatrack as a sampler, and then the sounds that you'll hear today are this. It's a desktop synth called the Waldorf Blofeld. It's a great digital synth from mid 2000s, late 2000s, and the MIDI will go into here. I'll do MIDI through over to here, so they get the same MIDI from my brain. And audio-wise, I'm running the synthesizer sound back into the Octatrack for some effect processing. So these two machines together are the source of the sound. Goes out the audio amplifier, and then you hear the music. The other thing I do, and this is a disadvantage of using iPhone apps as opposed to a computer. So because this port is taken up by MIDI going out, I can't also use that port to show the visuals. And so I'm relaying the EEG data from my brain over to another one via Bluetooth. It's a workaround. And so the visuals will be coming off of this app. So it's my live brain activity, but this HDMI and this MIDI cable can't share a port. I've tried splitters and it doesn't work. So that's what this whole bottom thing is. I'm relaying the EEG data to the visual app, out the projector or the screen. And this is the relationship of the main waves I'm using are alpha and delta, and as they go up and down, which you'll see in the live readout, as they go up and down and cross each other and create different thresholds of, they'll cross certain thresholds and they'll have different relationships to each other. So I'm always scanning those two and looking at what percentage is delta 30% higher than the lowest recent. So I've got these foundation lines. And so I'm grabbing percentage analysis of the waves in different ways to come up with a percentage of, right now my alpha is 30% higher than my delta. And I use those numbers relationally to make music decisions. The app does all the data mapping Is data mapping a phrase that's come up? Data mapping is you get data from a motion sensor, from an EEG, any sort of source, and it's what you do creatively with that data. That's data mapping. Okay. Let's get started. The visuals I have found have really helped to people seeing this, to see what my brain is doing as they're hearing it. There's been a few times where I've performed this where I didn't have visuals, and ended up working out, but there is something about the reinforcement, of the audio and the visual to be able to see, particularly something that's invisible, because thought is invisible. When I was working with emotion, the dancer and the motion sensors, always takes me a little bit to come out of this mental space and talk again. They could see that the dancer was triggering the music because they could see the dancer, but I think it helps for people to be able to see my thoughts. Do you have any questions? I wish I would have said that from the get-go at any point. Questions about this or really anything I've said in the last?
Just in response to your performance right now, what are the thoughts that you think in order to control and organize your brain waves and in order for not just cacophony to come out?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So part of that is in So part of that is in the container. So with the generative system, I've made decisions ahead of time how dense it can get, no matter what my brain is doing.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons I do a percentage value rather than just strict decibels. Because when I'm in my studio, my delta, I'm not going to be that stressed out in my studio, so my delta may go up to 20 decibels. But I've been at shows where it goes up to 50. So I thought, well, how do I account for that? You know, how do I make sure that the system isn't completely blown out of its container at a show versus being in the studio? And so I use percentages instead. And so I compare the delta to the alpha, and it's never going to go over 100% because I'm in a percentage range. So by creating the boundaries of the container, that's what keeps it from being complete cacophony. So I can choose, as the MIDI notes are being produced from the electrical activity going up and down. In this particular setup that I'm playing today, it's following certain brain waves, and as it's crossing thresholds, it's just shooting off. So it's almost that arpeggiated sound that you heard of the melodies of the synthesizers. Those get mapped into scales. So it's not dissonant notes. So all of it sounds, pretty, for lack of a better word. Choosing the instruments, part of the container is I'm playing a particular set of synthesizer sounds here and sending MIDI into this device. And I know this device and the sounds I've chosen sound good together. So the bass sound would sound good with the mids and with the high. And then density-wise, I have a level of quantization, so there's not too many notes landing within a certain moment. So it's not like I could do that if that's the effect I wanted, but I've got it paced out where it can only insert notes every so often coming from the brain activity. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it did.
And was there a follow-up?
There is. Have you ever, while performing, had a thought, because I have no way to relate to performing that, like, say you think of an apple, just the object of an apple, and then the sound that your brain makes an apple comes through the system. Have you ever thought of, or do you have a particular, for lack of a better word, like go-to sound that you like and are able to replicate from performance to performance that you like? Kind of just have in the back pocket as a bag of tricks?
Yes. So when I first got the system, I was thinking, if I think the word one, will that be different than thinking the word two? And it isn't, because they're both verbal.
Okay.
And so what the system picks up is just more electrical activity in the verbal center. And that electrical activity between the word one and two isn't distinguishable with this system, with this particular device. It might be with a full, like, over at in the speech department, they've got I think 128 sensors. You put the cap on, it takes like 2 hours to put it on. Yeah, this is just easier to use. So what I do is I move from different parts of my brain activity. So I can go from thinking words, which is the same as speech. According to, like, the brain doesn't know the difference between thinking words and saying words. Same with movement. So I can think about moving, or I can actually move, and that will trigger. I think theta starts to go up with movement. If I clear my brain, all of them will go down. And the way I've programmed the system is when my brain clears, it pulls notes out. So the system gets more sparse. The composition gets more sparse. What's that? If I move into a meditative state, my alpha goes up. And my go-to, the anchor for me, is listening to the actual music will increase alpha. And it becomes this feedback loop. So my brain is producing sound, and then if I listen to the sound that's currently producing, alpha goes up. And I've learned from a neuroscientist here that his take on alpha is actually, it's not a music-oriented necessarily. He said it's focus-oriented. So as I'm talking to you, and I'm not paying attention to anyone else, if I'm just focusing on you, my alpha and spatial, my alpha goes up in the parts of my brain that are going to block out other signals. Or if someone were speaking behind me and I'm talking to you, my alpha will increase in the back of my head to try to not hear the conversation behind me and listen to the conversation in front of me. And so when I focus on the music, it could be just the act of focusing is what's creating my alpha to go up. And then the creative part of it is when I move into that space, either a calm or a emotional calm or a mental nonverbal space, I had to make a decision, well, what would that sound like musically? And so what I do is I filter out the highs and increase the reverb so it becomes more of a subconscious sounding music. So it gets bassier and dreamier because that feels like the space I'm going into mentally. And then when I go into delta, so there were times that it were bassy, and then I would open my eyes, and the music would brighten up because I spike my delta just by opening my eyes and getting new input. So the music spikes and brightens up. So those are decisions I made creatively in the data mapping process of what data am I getting, and what does that feel like when my brain's outputting that data, and what would that sound like musically in order to then reinforce what I'm feeling. So to make those coherent with each other, what I'm feeling and the effect I wanted on the music.
Awesome. Color or motion?
I haven't thought of colors. That's great.
Well, if you think of color, like, you don't think color, like you're not like blue and imagine blue.
I
Or
haven't
if you
done
look
that.
at blue.
I've never done that with this system.
Because I wonder what would happen if like you just had a look at blue. Or
Right.
look at red.
Yeah.
'Cause
I don't know. I haven't done. You know, people have asked, what about different feelings? And I performed this at a festival maybe 6 weeks ago now, and it was the longest I performed it, so it was a full hour. And what happened was I went into this very intense, deep meditative state, but it was a very active meditation, and I hit this threshold where it was so much awareness and so much a feeling of profoundness that this system was working, and that was coming out of the speakers and then going back, and it was a large sound system, so I was feeling it, that I just started to weep because it was such a feeling of awe. And when that hit, I remember glancing down at, I've got a EEG readout on the master app as well, and I just saw my deltas like going through the roof. And so the music was just getting really like high up, intense, and just like blown out. And at a certain point, when it first started to hit, I was like, am I gonna have to take this off, like go into the woods and sob for a while and then like come back? And I was like, no, to stick with it, like go through this. But then I had to consciously calm myself down for the music to like come out of that really restricted, blasted out delta state into more mid-range. So I was just like, okay, get it together, man. Like, stop crying. You're in a performance. Like, you know, it's fine for a while, but at a certain point, like, the show has to continue. So I held onto the table and kind of did some deep breathing, and the music came down and opened up again. Yeah, I didn't expect that. Yes, in the background.
Have you ever tried this on people who have either like altered mental states, like if you're drunk, or people like someone who's autistic or someone who has OCD? Like, have you ever tried that in a different state of mind?
I have. I've tried it with a few different people. I did a presentation. It was one of the Iowa City public art grants, so I did this at the library, like in one of the meeting rooms, not like by the books. And one of the things that I did was I did it for a while and then had people come up and try the system themselves. There was a guy there who, I think he had a really bad seizure when he was young, and he's blind, mostly blind. And his values were slightly different. And when I was at that same festival where I performed, I found someone. It was hard to get someone who was peaking on LSD because it's hard to be like, hey, come with me. I want to do this thing. And like, trust me. But I did find someone who had peaked like 4 or 5 hours prior. and her brain was mostly normal. I am interested in doing research-wise like a full 8 to 12 hour experiment with someone who does hallucinogen, or maybe a shorter hallucinogen like mushrooms or DMT. But to have, put this system on, I want to get this system a little more responsive to the brain, because right now, when I wear it, or if Dan put it on, or anyone else in the room put it on, it's going to be similar. And that's what I found is most adults have pretty similar brain activity. So I want it to be more responsive and snapshot the brain in the moment that it's put on and form the music more from that snapshot. But what I have found was I had a friend that I was testing it with, and her family, we put it on her 4-year-old, and the 4-year-old's brain activity was quite different. The electricity coming out of the daughter's brain just isn't that much. So it was just, the music wasn't as dynamic, it was just kind of floating along, and I could see the waves weren't going super high. And then even her older brother, who was just 6, all of a sudden there was more dynamics. Even between those 2 years, there was more electricity coming out of his brain. And then the dad put it on, and it became very dynamic. And that's how the music is being made. It's been made by changes in the data. And so the more electrical changes there are in a brain, the more dynamic the music is. Yes?
So when you're controlling your mental state for an audience, I'm sure that must be a difficult task. Did you have prior interest in, before you started this project, in kind of controlling your thought patterns or things like that, or was that something that's sparked after this? And how do you, if so, like, do you use tools, such? I'm assuming that's the you mentioned meditation.
Yep. It was just a coincidence. So when doing this project, I'd done music for decades, I'd done technology for decades, and then I started meditating when I was 19. So I was here in Iowa City and had made friends with some people in Fairfield through the techno scene. And I didn't learn that specific technique, but just the idea of like sitting and meditating. So, I've had 20 plus years to, it's not a particular technique, I've rotated from different techniques, and I can use any of those during this. This room is, there's 20 people here, and you all seem friendly, so it wasn't too intimidating to try to get deep inside. But I did find with the longer form performance of being a full hour, I was really able to really go deeply into a place. And if it's a huge sound system and I can't hear people anymore, and I'm actually feeling the vibrations on my body, that creates a biofeedback amplification with the system, which is really profound to experience. The second time I did this, it was a big sound system, and I actually forgot the audience was there. I just went to a really deep place in my mind. Near the end, I opened my eyes and I was like, people. So it's been using those meditation techniques is how I'm able to manipulate the sound better. I think a good metaphor for explaining, it's kind of like a drum kit, so anyone can walk up to it, grab the sticks, and like make sound with it. But the more skilled you are as a drummer, you can do more nuanced things, and that's how this is. Like anyone's brain will make a sound with a system, but to have that then move from phase to phase, it requires those techniques that I've learned. And of course, I've built the system for my brain, and it responds the best, I think, to the shifts that I can do in my mind. And that's the advantage of doing this as performance art, as opposed to doing this in Silicon Valley and trying to market it to a mass audience. Like this is specifically pure experimentation and for art at this point. Other
What
questions?
music festival was it?
What's it?
What music festival? were you from?
Even further. Have you heard of it?
I don't know.
It's not a famous festival, but it's very historic. It started in '94, and '96 was the first Daft Punk US performance. So it's not a huge amount of people. It's like 1,500 to 3,000. And I know some of the current festivals are huge, like into hundreds of thousands. So it's always been a smaller festival, but
Is that in New York? Or?
no, it's actually in the Midwest. It's in Wisconsin and Chair. It's been northern Wisconsin the last few years. It was a promotion crew out of Milwaukee that used to throw raves called Drop Bass Network. Yep.
We're at time.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you
Well,
so much.
thank you
coming.
for allowing me to be here.